Good morning and welcome to another week of the video worship service here on the Park Avenue channel. So glad you have tuned in. You know, I'd like to give out a special shout out to someone who's always interested in the videos that we put on here, who's always encouraging me to continue doing them and to encourage me as I'm doing them. And that is Sister Flora Keeler. She has been an inspiration for me in a lot of aspects of my life. And I know that she loves watching these and she shares it with other people and she watches them with them. I want to say thank you to Miss Flora because she sure means a lot to the Park Avenue Church of Christ and she sure means a lot to me too. So thank you, Flo, for being you. All right, we'll have a song and then we'll have our lesson. And see you shortly.
I was sure by now, God, you would have reached down and wiped our tears away, stepped in and saved the day. But once again, I'll say amen, and it's still raining. As the thunder rolls, I barely hear you whisper through the rain. I'm with you, and as your mercy falls, I'll raise my hands and praise the God who gives and takes away. And I'll praise you in this storm, and I will lift my hands, for you are who you are, no matter where I am, and every tear I cry, you hold in your hand. You never left my side, and though my heart is torn, I will praise you in this storm. I remember when I stumbled in the wind, you heard my cry to you and raised me up again. But my strength is almost gone. How can I carry on if I can't find you? As the thunder rolls, I barely hear you whisper through the rain. I'm with you, and as your mercy falls, I'll raise my hands and praise the God who gives and takes away. And I'll praise you in this storm, and I will lift my hands, for you are who you are, no matter where I am, and every tear I cry, you hold in your hand. You never left my side, and though my heart is torn, I will praise you in this storm. And I'll praise you in this storm, and I will lift my hands, for you are who you are, no matter where I am, and every tear I cry, you hold in your hand. You never left my side, and though my heart is torn, I will praise you in this storm. And though my heart is torn, I will praise you in this storm.
Good morning, church, and welcome. Last week we began a series on finding our way in 2024, based on the premise of what we just read in Romans chapter 1 and some of the ideas we gathered from Ephesians chapter 2. And if you remember last week I read, as for you, You were dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the Spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. In those who are disobedient. And Paul makes a bold statement in the fact that the world is people are led in this world by either two entities, God or the ruler of this world, Satan. Every one of us needs to make up our mind who's the authority in our lives. Now, when you dismiss God as the authority, you're making Satan's the authority. It's not that you're implying that you know better. That's the lie of Satan. You do not know better. So, as we begin this finding our way in 2024, we're saying emphatically that we're giving the authority to God, not to ourselves, not to some group of people who we've appointed as, well, we agree with this group and we don't agree with that group, which will happen sometimes in churches. Some churches have different ideas of how you do things, and other churches have other ideas how you do things. Which one of them is right? Well, I don't always know. We all study the Bible. We read it, we glean from it, and we take information and we become obedient to it. That is how it works. Now, can two people disagree about something? Yes, they can. Well, could both of them be right and wrong? Possibly, but the thing is this. God has called us to be obedient to Him, and God will work out the details. We shouldn't be worried about all that information. Let's just make sure that when we're giving our lives to God in the authority, we're choosing to follow Him. Now, last week we read from Romans chapter 1, and we've talked about these four words: wrath, gospel, grace, and faith. All these words are in the book of Romans, probably almost more than anywhere else in the book. And the theme of Romans is sorting out the details. In Romans 1, verse 14, and I'm going to read it again from last week, I'm obligated both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish. That is why I am so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. Imagine you go into the doctor, and the doctor's called you in because you've had some tests and some blood work done because you've had this little ache or something going on in your life. Doctor calls you in and he says, well, we have some things we need to work with. I have some bad news. He then begins to go on and tell you that you have this, whether it be cancer, a disease, something, whatever it may be. He begins by giving you the bad news. He lets you know there's a problem. When Paul talks about, he makes that statement, I am not ashamed of the gospel. I have never met anybody who's ever apologized for good news. In fact, what do we always apologize for? Bad news. That doctor, probably when he goes to tell you, I'm sorry to inform you of this. It's disappointing, I know, that you're going to be dealing with this. They're not proud of the bad news they're about to give you. They're bothered by the bad news they're about to give you. But yet Paul says, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Which reminds me of something. Gospel, as we've talked about, The word means good news. But evidently in the dynamic of having good news, there is bad news. And we've talked about this. Verse 18 of last week, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. We talked about this last week. God's wrath is being revealed against all the godlessness and wickedness of people. It is evident. When you and I see things, we have a sense when we're looking at it correctly that this is wrong and this is right. Now, don't misunderstand me. That idea of right and wrong can be diluted and can be twisted and can be made to seem like it's right but it's wrong, or it's wrong but it's right. Those kinds of concepts can be manipulated. But when we get to core ideas, only when our false hope and false ideas goes into play, that's where the problem comes in our lives. In one aspect, we know what we're doing is wrong, and in the other aspect, we're trying to convince ourselves that it's okay. And we know it's not. And I want you to listen to Paul's reasoning for why what should be clearly seen has been misunderstood. Verse 21 of Romans chapter 1. For although they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like immortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. Wow. Paul brings up a very important, basic thought process. They said their thinking became futile because they ignored God. Now, you can ignore God in several different ways. You can know about God and know what He says and ignore what the truths that you've understood. That's one way to ignore God. Another way is just to actually say there is no God. The world that we live in has no God, so we can do whatever we want. And that's pretty much where we are a lot. But here is something that Paul brings up. Paul says that there's something that happens to the mind and the heart and the soul when those kinds of thoughts and thinking comes into play. Because he says, after he says, they neither glorified it as God nor gave thanks to Him as God. Okay? But their thinking, now that's the way you process information, that's the way you determine everything. Their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images. And he goes on to all these other things, but what it basically boils down to is they exchanged the glory of a God, a deity by which knows right and wrong, knows all the information. They exchanged that to worship human beings, to worship things, to worship, to look at it, people and esteem them. I mean, we've got people today who expect us to follow every single word they say. They are human beings. Why? Why would you follow a human being? Everyone should be then. And in fact, today it seems like in a world, every human being out there thinks they're God. Or at least acts like it. Verse 24. Therefore, now we always understand what therefore means. Therefore means taking into account what has just been said. Now, This is the conclusion. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their heart to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Paul again ties in a descending spiral steps that come into play. You ignore God. Your thinking becomes futile. Your heart becomes darkened. You exchange the glory of God to worship all these other things. And then next thing to happen, according to Paul, is the desires of your heart to sexual impurity go rampant. And you decide to exchange the truth about what God has said and worship and serve all these other things. You're going down a spiraling pit. And it doesn't get better as you go down. Paul says this in something that's really hard for us to grasp, this concept. Verse 26. Because of this, because of the spiral you're going down. You've ignored God, you've exchanged the truth of God for a lie, your thinking is futile, your heart is darkened. Paul writes, because of this, God gave them over to shameful lust. Even their women exchange natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. They've become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. God gave them over. This is where sometimes this becomes quite difficult. We have several times in the Bible where this comes into play. One of the early ones is in the story of Pharaoh at Egypt. God was trying to get Pharaoh to let his people go, and Pharaoh hardened his heart, would totally ignore, and it says that God then turned Pharaoh's heart on him. In other words, if this is what you want, I'll let you have it full tilt. It's almost as if God is trying to protect us as much as He can. But yet when we ignore God and ignore other things, God pulls His protection away. And He says, okay, if this is what you want, I will stand up. I will not be there for you in this. And it's like in the world they are living in, there's a small light that God is trying to show them, and they're ignoring it, and God then just pulls the light. And now you're in this thing all on your own. And Paul describes what that situation looks like. These shameful acts that Paul describes. And as I was reading there toward the end, furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, I mean, they've thrown God's understanding completely out the window. So God gave them over to a depraved mind. They've become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding. no fidelity, no love, no mercy, although they know God's righteous decrees that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. Today, and it's even hard to even talk about some of this stuff. I grew up in a period of time where I was sheltered from a tremendous amount of the evil that's in the world today. I grew up out in the country. I mean, it was just idyllic. But idyllic is gone. And it has spiraled now to such a degree that the normal way of doing things is out of control. All those attributes, we live in a world filled with wickedness and evil and greed, full of envy, murder and strife and deceit and malice, gossiping, slandering, arrogant and boastful. People, as Paul writes, invent ways of doing evil. People today, it is out of control. It is completely out of control. And his last statement there is, they disobey their parents. And if anybody has been out in public, recognizes that is unbelievable what is happening there. The bad news. The good news of Jesus Christ will never make sense unless the light of the bad news of what the world could look like is not demonstrated. Back when I was young, Romans 1 would have seemed like a historical idea of what Rome looked like, or some different times in history where the social framework of a particular society had broken down and it had turned into chaos and the worst of the worst being elevated. We would have thought, well, I'm glad it's not like that around here. But today, that's what around here looks like. Those elements that we've been talking about. So, when we go to talk to people about the good news of Jesus Christ, this is going to be one of those moments where you may think to yourself, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Why is that? Because even though I'm going to have to give you some bad news, I got some good news. But you're going to have to give an account of the bad news. That is where we are as a society that we desperately need to take a look at. We have forgotten what the bad news is. And we need to remind people that the way you live, the way you think, the attitudes you have, the actions you take, the importance you put in various places, they hold you accountable. And a lot of times you and I can't see that because of that spiral. Remember that there's a time where we're on the precipice of falling over the cliff. And God keeps holding on to us and keeps trying to get us to see, and we keep ignoring God. And we begin to exchange the truth of God for a lie. What would that lie, what could some of those lies be? It doesn't matter how many times a week or how often you attend church. It doesn't matter what you watch on TV. It doesn't matter where you spend your money. It doesn't matter how much time you spend with your children. It doesn't matter where you put your money. It doesn't matter what people say. It's just you and God. Those things matter. And how are you going to not know unless you're paying attention? unless your heart is directed toward God. Because the problem comes in is the fact that sometimes Satan tricks you. He tricked Adam and Eve. He is, as Jesus put it, the father of lies. And you and I have desperately got to get to the point where we recognize the truth. And we recognize the good and the bad. How do we do that? By setting our minds and our hearts toward God and looking at what we elevate and what we make important in the world that we live in. We have got to see the desperation of sin in our lives, and that God is our only cure, and God is our only good news.